Welcome. This is Breanne Lowe, State Biologist with the Indiana USDA NRCS. This webinar is designed to provide an overview of the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide, or WHEG, for Indiana. The WHEGs I will be discussing today over the course of the next few modules are specific to Indiana and are the generalized land use WHEGs. I will not cover WHEGs associated with the program-specific initiatives such as the Working Lands for Wildlife Monarch, Bobwhite and Grasslands, or the RCPP Grasslands for Game Birds and Songbirds WHEG. The overall functionality of these WHEGs is quite similar to the land use WHEGs we will cover. All of these WHEGs, when released or updated, will be available on the Electronic Field Office Technical Guide. So what is a WHEG? The purpose of the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide is to provide a conservation planning decision support tool to identify wildlife-related resource concerns and the appropriate practices to address those resource concerns. They may also provide insight into the appropriate design of practices to improve and maximize wildlife habitat. These evaluations are used to identify habitat limitations and enable planners to compare alternatives and their impact to the habitat. NRCS policy, as well as the National Biology Handbook and Manual, require that a WHEG score meet a minimum of 0.5 on a scale of 0 to 1 to meet the minimum planning criteria for a resource management system. If the evaluation determines that the current habitat quality is less than a 0.5 on that scale of 0 to 1, recommendations may be made to the landowner to improve the existing habitat. If the evaluation determines that the existing condition is greater than 0.5, recommendations may be made to maintain the existing habitat in its present condition or to improve it further towards optimum conditions. Please note that for some species-specific needs or projects, such as the Monarch or the RCPP GGS, a higher WHEG score is required, such as a 0.6 for the RCPP GGS or the Monarch WHEG requiring a minimum score of 0.55 to meet planning criteria. When using a WHEG, it is important to identify what it is you are assessing within the landscape. On the screen is an example of a project area and the assessment areas to be evaluated with a WHEG. This example comes from the Monarch WHEG, but can relate to all the other WHEGs included in Indiana. The blue outline shows the project area, which may be similar to a tract or farm polygon. The yellow areas are assessment areas that are where actual footprints of habitat may or may not be included. So again, looking at the whole tract, the assessment is only looking at the footprint areas of where the habitat is being evaluated or may be placed on the ground. In Indiana, our land use WHEGs are broken into two categories: the associated ag land grass dominated and the associated ag land wood dominated. The associated ag grass dominated land use is intended for perennial cover, either native or planted. It's herbaceous plant dominated and not monotypic grasses, hay, or pasture. Woody cover should not exceed 25%. This includes areas that are existing field borders, odd areas, or habitat patches. This also includes areas that are currently in cropland, hay, or pasture, but are being converted to wildlife habitat. Associated ag wood dominated is again perennial cover, but this time wood dominated. It may be native or planted and will have greater than 25% woody cover. This is primarily for fence rows, odd areas, riparian areas, and wooded draws. Also includes areas that are currently monotypic grasses, cropland, or pasture, but are being converted to woody or shrubby habitat. Please note that forest land will be planned using a forest management plan and not require a WHEG at this time, unless 420 wildlife habitat planting is scheduled on the land unit. Species-specific WHEGs, as mentioned earlier, are available for monarch conservation or the bobwhite in grasslands. There is also a program-specific WHEG for the RCPP GGS. Refer to those WHEGs when planning for those programs or species. When trying to decide between the land use WHEGs, whether grass dominated or wood dominated, it is important to evaluate based on the end goal. Working with the landowner, determine what the landowner's goals and intent for the property is. What species are they interested in? What are the current conditions on the site? As mentioned, the wood dominated is not intended for forest land situations, but patchy land, such as that which is visible in this upper left image on your screen. Patches of habitat connected with corridors are perfect examples of habitat that can be evaluated with the woody land use WHEG. It would also be possible to look into these hayfields and use the wood dominated if the landowner intended to plant additional trees or shrubby habitat for wildlife species. If the landowner intended to plant cover such as that which is on the bottom left, such as pollinator habitat, or that on the bottom right, such as pheasant or quail habitat, then it may be more appropriate to use the grass-dominated WHEG. When it is unknown which of these habitat types the landowner is interested in, or the landowner is hoping to get some advice, it may be necessary to look at the benchmark scores in both of these habitat types and then determine maybe where the best way to proceed is from there, and then finalize the WHEG using the final end goals. The WHEG tool itself is set up in Excel. All of the WHEGs are located in a single location. Instructions for all the WHEGs are located in the first tab in the Excel spreadsheet, and then the associated ag WHEGs, as well as the programmatic WHEGs and the Monarch WHEG, are all included within that file. When completing the WHEG, landowner information should be placed on the top, including their name, the farm and tract number, a description of the management or planned practices, field number, and the acres being evaluated. Typically, you would only include one of the assessment areas per WHEG, but in some instances, it may be appropriate to lump multiple assessment areas together when they are in close proximity with very similar habitat cover and providing essentially a larger block of habitat or a larger patch of habitat together. If they are separated by large distances or by an entire field, it is most likely more appropriate to separate these assessment areas out. However, it is up to the planner and the landowner to decide the most appropriate way to assess and to whether to lump or to split those assessment areas. Within each of the WHEGs, there are primary habitat evaluation factors as well as landscape evaluation factors, and we will get into these in more detail in the following modules for each of the cover types. The primary habitat factors list characteristics that are important in wildlife habitat and their associated value or score from a scale of 0 to 1. The benchmark score is the current status on the site. Recommended practices is included to provide examples of practices that could be used to improve that benchmark score. This is not all-inclusive, but is a general listing of ways to improve that habitat score for that factor. And then the planned score is where the landowner plans to intend to take that habitat by using those installation practices. At the end of the rating, a habitat index score and a classification will be provided. These are broken down based on the scores 0 to 0.25, 0.26 to just below 0.5, 0.5 being the threshold as we discussed earlier, up to 0.69 and 0.7 to 1. Poor, fair, good, and excellent. To the right, you see the PHSI, which is the Primary Habitat Suitability Index score, which in this case, the benchmark score. And based on the ratings, you will receive a category of that poor, fair, good, or excellent. Then you will also receive one for the planned conditions, which must meet a minimum of good to meet planning criteria. The landscape scores, which we will look at in more detail, look at characteristics of the immediately surrounding landscape to the habitat that will be installed. This may include the cropland, pasture, hay, or forest land being managed around the habitat patch to be installed, but could have an impact on those areas. Again, looking at what is including those landscape factors in, what is the current condition and what does that condition become once the planned practices are installed. For all of the WHEGs to meet planning criteria, we must get the planned habitat suitability index to a status of good. If the status is already good, we need to see an increase in that numeric habitat suitability index score. We recognize there are several situations where it is obvious that the habitat will improve with the installation of any of our habitat establishment practices. These include conditions where cropland is present, monotypic grasses such as a fescue field, or low diversity and overgrazed pasture. In these situations, any installation of additional habitat is likely to benefit wildlife. So our benchmark rating will begin at poor, and when this category is selected or marked with an X, we will immediately jump to a planned rating of good. It is not possible to get to a planned rating of excellent using the rapid assessment model, but it is possible to get to a good and meet the planning criteria. If it is desirable to see if a site will reach a planned rating of excellent, a site assessment is required. In any condition where existing vegetation does not meet these three broad categories of crop, monotypic grasses, or low diversity and overgrazed pasture, a full assessment is required. So what about the Conservation Assessment and Ranking Tool, or CART? CART will be released this fiscal year in 2020 and will include sections to evaluate the wildlife resource concerns on a particular land unit. CART does incorporate the opportunity for the WHEG, and as CART is rolled out, we will provide more guidance on how to use the WHEG and incorporate it into this assessment tool. Associated ag land in CART does not include any national questions and will absolutely require the use of the Indiana land use WHEGs, but the WHEGs will also be incorporated in other ways as well. So let's explore some examples. In the next modules, we will look at a number of different land cover types and different habitat practices that may be installed on these types that are typical to situations found here in Indiana. These are not intended to be all-inclusive, but will give a broad range of examples to hopefully clarify how to use the WHEGs and where it is appropriate to use each of the land use WHEGs. There are 6 modules in total, including this overview. We will begin with cropland and with new grassland habitat in Module 2. Thank you.